Before we get into this episode, there's something that might be of interest that I wanted to tell you about. Scene and Heard, who run this podcast, have been asked by Scotland Food and Drink to undertake a strategic review of the Scotland Food and Drink Excellence Awards. Now, these Excellence Awards have been going for almost 20 years and are a huge mainstay of the food and drink sector. But it's time to ensure that they're still relevant. So if you have ever been involved in the Scotland Food and Drink Excellence Awards, or even if you've ever had an opinion about them, we would love for you, please, to complete our survey. So if you go to the OnFARM Twitter, which is at @on_farm UK, and click the link in the bio, there will be a tab in there that will take you to the survey, and it should only take you a very short while to complete, but we would be enormously grateful.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This next session really is at the top of the agenda.
Welcome to the latest edition of the OnFARM podcast. I'm whispering because we're at the back of the NFU Scotland AGM and we're listening to Martin Kennedy, NFUS Vice President, who's talking about climate change. We've got a number of experts on the stage talking for over an hour about the topic, and it's also the topic of our podcast today, so we're really keen to find out more.
Show how we are actually part of a positive solution when it comes to climate change.
So we've stepped outside of the main room now and we're in the foyer area. We're recording an entire episode now about climate change, and there's been some amazing presentations on stage, huge amount of thought-provoking stuff, lots of brilliant questions from the audience. But I'm now joined by three experts from within the climate change sector. I've got Mike Robinson with me. Mike is the Chief Executive of the Royal Scottish Geographical Society. We also have Nigel Miller, who is a former NFU Scotland President. And we also have Ruth Taylor, who is the first ever NFU Scotland Climate Change Policy Manager. So I think that in itself is fairly significant. Mike, I'm going to start with you if that's okay. Not everybody listening to this podcast will necessarily know the statistics in terms of the challenges that have been set. And so can you tell us briefly about those?
Well, the latest set of emissions targets, as laid down last year, are that we will achieve net zero emissions by 2045 in Scotland and 2050 in the rest of the UK. Of course, that's an important headline target, but it's also a little bit distant too. So probably a more realistic target is to focus on is a 75% reduction by 2030, and that's a very significant move from where we are at the moment. That comes with lots of complexity. There's issues around not just simply exporting the problem by trying to import stuff instead that's actually maybe produced in a more inefficient way. So we've got to be really careful that we are making the most of our own produce and our own expertise. But we also are going to have to radically shift some of the operations that we have and not keep ignoring the importance of carbon and other greenhouse gases. In agriculture, actually, nitrogen is hugely important. Only transport and agriculture really impact nitrogen. And of course, methane has a role to play too.
Methane, CO2. Can you explain a little bit the interaction between those two and perhaps any misconceptions that people have about which is which and what they do?
Well, I mean, methane is probably the biggest gas that is directly impacted by agriculture. But the thing about methane is it doesn't last in the atmosphere that long. It's usually only sort of 28, 30 years before it starts to degrade. Carbon dioxide actually sits there for a very, very long time, hundreds of years. Nitrogen only really for maybe 100, 150. So I think we forget sometimes it's a bit like having a loch or a pond and you started throwing rubbish in it. Eventually it would fill up with rubbish. It has nowhere to go. And I think sometimes we forget the atmosphere is like that. There is nowhere for this to just dissipate. You stick it in the atmosphere, it's there, and it'll stay there until you do something to actively remove it. So carbon dioxide still remains the biggest concern overall because it is so long lasting. But methane is much more impactful. It's something like 28 times the impact of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere whilst it's there.
There's been an awful lot in the press of all channels lately. I suppose, for want of a better phrase, farmer bashing or being very critical of the farming sector. How accurate do you think some of that coverage has been, and how can we make sure that what we're saying today at this conference is completely accurate?
I mean, well, there's a lot of questions in that. The first is, how often are the media accurate? There's an interesting question in itself. I think the NFUS should worry less about the Daily Express and the Daily Mail and worry more about the bigger picture. It's a very complex issue, solving climate change. There isn't one single silver bullet. There's not one absolute, we mustn't do this, we must do that, other than reduce fossil fuel emissions. So actually how we go about it is a very complex, nuanced, balanced equation. We don't want to lose sight of societal gains. We don't want to lose sight of biodiversity issues. We don't want to lose sight of economic reasons for running farms. We can't make it unsustainable to do that. But we must get to net zero by 2045. So there's an awful lot of things to consider. I think there is probably a bit too much targeting of agriculture in some ways, because the way it's currently counted doesn't actually do agriculture any great favours. But equally, there hasn't been enough effort within agriculture to mitigate climate emissions. I mean, the biggest single issue is meat consumption. I don't think anybody really realistically thinks that less meat consumption is a better thing generally. But what the sort of agricultural community's got to try to do is just acknowledge that it's not an issue. It's not a major change. It's not a fundamental never again. It's a slight reduction is actually what it's portrayed. And I think the UKCCC only present it as a 20% reduction. It's actually beneficial for lots of different reasons. So move on from that. Agriculture's got a huge both responsibility but also opportunity to tackle this issue on many more fronts than just red meat. It's much broader than that. It's about soil carbon. It's about practices on the farm. It's about nitrogen use. It's across a whole spectrum of activity. Let's embrace that as the challenge and get away from a slightly one-dimensional media story about meat. It's a much bigger issue than that.
How optimistic do you feel about the farming industry's ability and willingness to tackle this head-on?
I always remain optimistic about this, but at the end of the day, like everybody else, and this is nothing peculiar to the agricultural industry. This is true of everybody and all industry. We all need to do more. One of the things I think is often happening is that people have an anxiety about hypocrisy on climate change because they're always conscious of what they're not doing. And by being so hung up on that feeling of hypocrisy, they're not talking about what they are doing. They're afraid of being shot down for what they're not doing. None of us is doing enough. We all need to do more. So acknowledge that and get on and do the things you can do.
I know you said there is no silver bullet, so this may be slightly putting you on the spot here, but I wonder, we have listeners who are farmers, many of them, but also many who aren't. So I wonder if you could tell me two things. One, what one thing do you think non-farmers should be doing? And what one thing do you think farmers should be doing? I might allow you two if you need to.
I might need more than one. Farmers, I think, well, my personal immediate focus would be around nitrogen. I think there's some real easy win-wins there in terms of restricted use of nitrogen, which I think isn't going to massively upset anything. I think could actually be delivered quite quickly. I think the issue and part of the point of the inquiry is, so actually, how do you help deliver that? What's required? Is it expertise? Is it support? Is it funding? Whatever. In terms of individuals, non-farmers, actually... So my answer, I mean, of course, it could be transport, it could be all sorts of things, but actually the answer I'm going to give is that all of us probably deep down recognise that we need to do something. And we all recognise that other people need to do something. So what we actually, all of us can do is allow some of the changes that need to take place, be more permissive. We know there's change required, but there's always a sense, and certainly if you read some media, that every single thing that's put forward as a potential solution is knocked back as, either completely unacceptable or not going to work. We've got to pick our solutions, we've got to be consistent, and we've all got to pull in the same direction. And in some cases, even if you can't directly help make that happen, allow it to happen. Give people permission to make the change.
Sadly, I'm not, but if I was heading off to maybe South Africa on my holidays and I was thinking, but that's okay because I'll just go on one of these offsetting websites and my problem will be solved, what would you say to me?
Stop it. I would say, okay, so there's a really important point, and it's true of every single sector and every single activity. There's a hierarchy of behaviours. There's a hierarchy of fossil fuels. The first and most obvious thing you should always be doing is cutting back or cutting stuff out. It's got to begin with that because nothing else is particularly credible. And actually, if you look at consumption emissions and not production emissions in this country, the story's nowhere near as rosy. So we've got to cut back first, and that's the first thing you should always be trying to do. Then if you can't do that, you look at options and alternatives. You look at other ways to get there. So if you're determined to go to South Africa, see if there's other ways to get there. And actually one of the things I think we forget is that it challenges the way we think. It's much more, needs a lot more ingenuity. But actually there's an awful creativity and a complete adventure in doing things differently. There's actually a slowtravel.com website where you can get any freight ship anywhere in the world. We need to look at other ways to do things.
Yeah.
So that's the options and alternatives.
Thinking outside the box.
Yeah. If you can't do that, and only if you can't then do that, you then move to option 3, which is to capture emissions in some way.
Yeah.
And that's, again, legitimate, but only if you can't do the 2 before. Mm-hmm. And then only when you can't do that, you should then think about offsetting. The problem we have at the moment is every time you give people alternatives, they'll always try and take the easiest alternative first.
Yes.
So there's a huge amount of conversations about offsetting. If you actually look closely at the climate legislation in this country, it tries to prohibit offsetting. So it's not the answer. This is not the first, and it's definitely not the first answer. It's the last resort.
Absolutely. And perhaps not enough people realise that.
Definitely not enough people realise that.
So, Nigel, Mike tried to help us all to understand the difference between methane and CO2, but I know that was something that you thought might be worthwhile adding to that.
Mike's thoughtful and very pragmatic, and I think we've obviously discussed things off the record quite a lot, and we are in probably pretty much the same place. Well, we are in the same place, I think. It's a matter of just how you express your goals. Mike's comment, which was about being open to change or not blocking change, is actually quite important. It's a mindset thing. The reality is we're going to go through an extraordinary period of change, but farming always has done and has been really good at actually grasping these things, and it's really just I guess a plea for farmers to have that open mindset as they have in the past, not just about their systems and the way we do things and their businesses, but also about land use as well. We can actually be smarter in the way we use land and still farm.
I know you talked on the stage earlier about a menu of options. Now, I'm absolutely not expecting you to remember that menu now, but can you give us some sort of concrete examples of what people can actually start doing literally from tomorrow onwards?
Yeah, well, I think the key thing about the menu is that there's all sorts of management interventions you can do where you get a marginal gain. They're not a quick fix which is suddenly going to move you to a low carbon system. It's a matter of actually looking at your system and accumulating a whole range of changes which moves the whole business. I guess in some ways they fall into categories. There's precision farming, and I guess the arable sector has been really good at taking that up, probably dairy farmers as well, as far as nutrition goes. But some of the GPS we have and auto steer, field mapping and yield mapping, so which we actually vary the inputs or the nutrients onto the soil, these are really smart ways of actually reducing our carbon footprint. Then if we look at the way we manage our slurry and manure and our nitrogen fertilisers, again there are ways of doing that so we budget correctly how we use them, but also we apply them at the right time in the correct method and balance it to the soil status. And again, a lot of us are doing that, but we could actually do it better. And then there's pretty obvious win-wins, things like animal health. If you improve animal health, you can maybe reduce emissions by 9 or 10% overall. Now that's a bit of a catch-all, but it gives you an idea of what's achievable. Genetics, just by using the normal balanced breeding goals which we have just now, again, if we all did that over a period, we could, without anything new in our genetics, we could actually improve our footprint or reduce our emissions by 9 or 10%. Nutrition, getting clover into swards, using more diverse swards, having a rotation where there's a legume involved, looking at stubble management so that we can maybe either maintain a green stubble or sow in something like mustard to scavenge the nitrogen so you don't actually have emissions coming off, you trap it and then you cultivate it in as a nutrient for the next crop. Things which are good farming practice, but it's a matter of actually being more disciplined and making use of those devices. A lot of them are actually cost neutral, some are cost positive, some cost you. Things like covering slurry stores. injection or trailing shoes for slurry application, big wins, 40 or 60% reduction in emissions, but these are costly machines, so maybe you need your support for contractors or farmers to invest. We're looking at 30% reduction, is achievable now.
I don't know a huge amount about this topic, so I feel as though I've learned a huge amount in the last 2 hours. And one area which particularly interests me, and which I think many or most non-farmers will know very little about, which you do as a former vet, is the genetic side of things. Can you maybe just explain that in a little bit more detail for the uninitiated?
The genetics in plants is actually quite interesting, but you put that to one side. Genetics in livestock have really been initially focused on production traits. So whether it be milk yield or whether it be growth rates, whatever, that's what's really driven things. In more recent times, they've looked at more balanced breeding goals. They look at fitness traits, feet, locomotion. Sometimes they've even looked at disease resistance, but also at reproductive efficiency and things like that. So it's a more balanced breeding goal, and that's where we are now. The next stage is really looking at and maybe creating a climate change index, and that climate change index would start incorporating other more direct breeding goals like feed conversion efficiency, which we've looked at in the past, but we probably haven't really taken to the limit except in poultry and things like that. But the one exciting one which SRUC are working on is actually methane production. It looks as if there's real gains to be made there, and it is quite heritable, a heritability of 0.4%. So you could actually select animals which produce less methane, do convert feed more efficiently, and you'll have, balanced breeding goals incorporated as well. And so you'd go to a new generation of livestock, which you could actually contribute to our climate change targets. It's a really exciting time. There's a lot of science going on, and I think that if we look at nitrogen fixing in crops, that's an area that genetically you could actually improve, but also improve the period that the nitrogen fixing takes place, so you're not using so much fertilizers, and changing the mix of herbs within a sward so that there's greater depth of roots, so you're sequestering carbon to a deeper level. And soil carbon is at the basis of climate change farming. So this is exciting stuff too. And if we look at the livestock, there's things we can actually do with feeding. There's anti-methanogens, actually feed additives that we can use to reduce methane. One of those 3-NOPA, which is being looked at abroad just now in the US. It's not licensed here yet, but it's showing reductions between 10 and 80% in different systems. So we've not just got the genetics, we've also got work going on at an SRUC are looking at other anti-methanogens, including seaweed extracts. We've got all sorts of tools which we can use beyond our more precision nutrition and our precision inputs of nutrition, which could actually revolutionise our livestock sector.
Wow. Ruth, my first question to you was going to be, why does NFU Scotland need a climate change policy manager? But I think Nigel has just told us all of the reasons why your job is completely essential, because it sounds like you've got a lot to do. Can you tell us a bit about your role and how it's going to be contributing to some of the things that Nigel's just explained to us?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first thing to kind of cover would be climate change is top of the agenda for NFU Scotland. We're really keen that farmers are part of the solution to climate change, and like Nigel says, there's a whole kind of range of measures that can kind of be taken.
There are many challenges, obviously. I see one of them as being how you actually communicate this to the industry in a way that makes them want to pick it up and run with it with enthusiasm. So how do you think you'll be able to go about doing that?
I think it's something Mike talked about earlier, and I think it's mostly about communicating those kind of win-wins and the uptake of measures in the short term that are win-win for a lot of people working within the sector. I think that's really, really important. It can be an intimidating topic and kind of feel a little bit inaccessible, and that's something in my role that I can kind of make it a little bit more accessible and make the whole topic seem a little bit less daunting.
Yeah. And within the farming community, how has the reception been to your role being created? I'm really interested to hear about that.
Yeah, well, everybody's been very nice so far. I've been really lucky. I've been to quite a few different kind of branch meetings and AGMs, and everybody's been very welcoming, very enthusiastic, willing to kind of engage and ask questions and make sure that, we are kind of finding answers, finding solutions and working together.
Do you think most people are willing and keen to make that positive contribution and make those changes themselves?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a great deal of willingness and enthusiasm within the sector. I think, people are really keen to engage. People do recognise that it is something that, ultimately we have to engage with going forward.
Nigel was telling us about, gave us some amazing examples, some of which are low or no cost, but others, as he said, have got a cost attached to them. What are the mechanisms whereby farmers can try and deal with those in terms of seeking funding or things like that?
Yeah, so I think funding and support for the sector going forward will be vital ultimately. I know that the Climate Change Act that was passed in Scottish Parliament last year makes reference to an agricultural transformation fund. The Scottish Government's programme for government that was brought in September 2019 makes reference to an agricultural innovation fund. I think things like that can help.
Yeah. Some people are struggling to get the day job done. They may not have this at the top of their priority list, and actually, maybe just as importantly, they may not know what they need to do and how they can find out information. So what would be the first step for somebody who really hasn't looked at this in their business before?
I guess it's a matter of giving people information but choice. I'm particularly keen on a menu system because it hopefully allows you to have a whole spectrum of opportunities, some of which are quite simple and some of which you will be familiar with. And maybe if you actually introduce it gradually, people maybe have a lower target for the first year or two. They can actually draw down off that menu 4 or 5 things that they're comfortable with. And then as the climate priorities rise, you actually increase the targeting in that menu, so they have to go into more difficult options. Now, to actually allow them to do that, you need to have probably at least the opportunity to get one-to-one phone advice, maybe one-to-one support as well on farm, because not only is it a matter of making change, but if we're actually going to deliver on international commitments, we've actually got to audit this. So the idea of having a menu system which is through greening means that you actually capture the changes that people sign up to, and it's audited in some way. And in doing so, as you gradually build that menu with support from advisors, you've almost created a climate change plan for that farm, which is tailored to that system, to that holding, so it actually fits with that. And it allows people to go down different routes. They may go down a very high-tech intensive route, or they may choose to be fairly extensive and be almost organic and look at sequestration opportunities. But it's important that all our farmers have a destination that they actually buy into. And I think to underpin that, we've actually got to relook at the way we manage our soils. We probably want to make that mandatory so that farmers understand what carbon status they have, and the Competent Authority does on a national database, because it not only is a fantastic evidence base for agriculture and all the value it does, but it also allows farmers to manage their soil organic matter better, and it allows us to look at weaknesses where we could actually improve, because sequestration and soil carbon management will be part of the solution. And it also underpins greater production, lower fertiliser use, and soils which can actually be resilient under high and low rainfall incidents. So it's a win-win. So use that as a culture change, have a menu where people can choose and give direct support to them.
I think that's really important, actually, because people have got to feel as though the plan is tailored to them and specific to them, and it's not just some sort of off-the-shelf thing that they're supposed to do their best to follow. In order for them to engage with it, they've really got to feel as though it's relevant to their business, I think.
I would completely agree with that. I think what Nigel said about having a destination that we can all buy into is really, really important. I think as well, a lot of these solutions, having a menu of options for people will be really important in recognising that the landscape is different across the whole of Scotland. So having things that individual farmers can do and buy into in the long term, that's going to be, maintain or improve production, be profitable, and kind of, help reduce their emissions will be really important.
And I think you've both quite rightly used, when you've been speaking, the word profitability, and I know today there are 2 sessions both looking at profitability. Well, that's going to be critical in this, as in, it's critical for everything, because if a farm isn't profitable, they're not going to be able to have the money to invest in some of these measures. So, Nigel, what do you think of the relevance of that?
Yeah, well, the inquiry is very much focused on a positive pathway for agriculture and also for the landscape and biodiversity. Profitable businesses are absolutely key to that, unless we actually maintain it. The sad reality is that a lot of businesses are only marginally profitable just now, and 60% require direct support at least to actually be profitable. And I don't think we can forget that. The reality is that going forward, a form of direct support which also ensures that there's a sustainable income off the unit is absolutely crucial. This isn't an era where we can pull back from agriculture and let the market solutions kick in. Not if we want to have rural communities which are vibrant, not if we want to have diverse food production, and not if we want to have biodiversity and nice landscapes. So it's a matter of framing that in a way which underpins change and underpins low-carbon farming. And certainly for capital investments, we need a capital investment fund to actually underpin that. And also for forestry or agroforestry or peat restoration, hedges, we need to have funding for that which allows people easy access. At the moment, forestry funding excludes agroforestry. The planting densities required mean that it's just not a non-starter for many people.
And Ruth, what are the other measures that the union is putting in place to, I suppose, smooth the way and make it as easy as possible for its members to start getting involved with some of these measures and the menu that Nigel's outlined?
My role is really crucial in that, and kind of signifying kind of a long-term intent on this issue. We have a dedicated researcher working on a lot of these issues, and it's been really great to kind of work closely with her and learn a lot from her expertise. I think also going forward it'll be really, really important for us to help communicate the benefits that agriculture has for the wider environment and for the climate, and to work alongside other policymakers, stakeholders and essentially the government to make sure that any policy coming forward reflects the realities of agriculture in Scotland.
And throughout the process and the journey not that we're just embarking on because we've been on this journey for a long time, but the journey that is ahead, how do you think the industry can best communicate that farmers are part of the solution rather than the problem?
So as a union, we've kind of partnered with various organisations going forward to do just that, to celebrate what we've done as an industry and to show what more we can do as part of the solution. I think COP, the Climate Change Conference in Glasgow this year, will also be a really, really key opportunity for Scotland itself and also for various industries, especially agriculture, to showcase that.
Well, I can add to that. I think that we tend to be reactive. If we get bad publicity, we're probably pretty sensitive to it, and the instinct is to react to that, and that generally doesn't actually make things any better. It doesn't move the debate. I think that if the industry is actually going to have a better image or show a true image, we've got to have a plan with defined end goals which is transparent and people can see it. And we've actually got to have some form of auditing which again is transparent and we can see it. So as an industry we're actually providing solutions and we're providing real goals which are positive for society, positive for biodiversity, positive for food. If we can do that, maybe we can move away from this appalling sort of attrition between various single lobby groups and ourselves, which gets us nowhere.
So we'll finish up with Ruth. Ruth, you're in a position whereby you are the first ever climate change policy manager. So no pressure, but what's on your to-do list? You've been in job for 3 months. What do you want to achieve in the rest of 2020?
I think 2020 for Scotland and for the climate change conversation is really, really important. It's a really exciting time. On my to-do list I'm really keen to make sure that we have a strong voice at the climate change conference. It's coming to Glasgow in November, and really keen to kind of build on a lot of the partnerships that we've already started, working with Scottish Wildlife Trust, with Nourish, and really kind of keen to keep these partnerships going.
Great, thank you very much and good luck. Thank you so much for listening to another episode of OnFARM. I hope you enjoyed it. It was a busy one and a noisy one, but it's been really enjoyable and really vibrant. So you know how to find us, I hope, now online, on Twitter and everywhere else. Apple Podcasts and Spotify, if you want to listen, just search for OnFARM. And thank you very much. We'll see you next time.